Yes, and recording OBS as well. Why do I? Okay, there we go. Now I have video. And let's get chat up.
All right, I see us live. Sweet. Oh
yeah. What?
I keep disappearing behind the YouTube tab for you.
I know.
Live. Sweet.
I know why. Yeah, there we go. Okay. What?
I keep disappearing behind the YouTube tab for you.
I know.
Alrighty.
I know why. Yeah. Oh, and now we get an echo. Let me mute that. Okay. All right. I remember my first.
Are we good to go?
I remember my first podcast. All right. Let me see here. Okay. All right. If you are ready, I am ready.
All right. It's thinking today on.
You're on.
All righty. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Press B to Cancel. You'll notice the ranks are a little emptier today than usual. Everybody else was busy. It's Father's Day weekend. People are on trips out of town. So it's just us.
Hello.
So I'm joined by the incomparable Sinistar 77.
Wow. Incomparable. Wow. Well, thank you for that.
And I am your host, Werewolf.
Well, I mean, on the little start screen, it selected you as the host. So there you go.
Yeah, there we go then.
Yeah.
Today we're going to be talking about the Dreamcast, and boy oh boy is that thing a roller coaster ride of information and games and everything else. Wow.
Indeed.
So I guess we should maybe dive in with a little history of the Dreamcast, like a little bit of the timeline.
Mm-hmm.
So the Dreamcast, it was fast-tracked is probably the best term for it. After the massive success of the Sega Saturn, Sega was like, they knew it was already on the wall. They saw the writing on the wall before the Saturn even released, and they started development on the Dreamcast before the Saturn was even released. And I mean, that's a pretty esoteric way to say it, because they were like employing multiple R&D paths to try and develop the next console to supersede the Saturn.
Right. Wasn't like Sega Japan and Sega US working on two entirely different paths, if I remember right?
That was even before the Saturn, honestly.
Okay. Because I know that Sega USA was in talks with 3DFX, and in fact, I think 3DFX took NEC.
That was actually Sega Japan was doing that.
Was it? Okay.
So they were in talks and actually bought something like 16% of 3DFX.
Yeah.
To sort of signal the intent with the deal and everything. But they ended up going with NEC because 3DFX was North America. And I mean, part of it was probably they were getting a cheaper deal with NEC. It was probably cheaper costs to get the chips to where they needed to, because it was a neighbor instead of across the ocean. So there were a bunch of contributing factors. 3DFX tried to sue.
Mm-hmm.
It was a whole mess. EA backed out and everything because of the swap. Like, it was a huge problem for Sega. But ultimately, sort of both R&D paths sort of merged a little bit and kind of became one uniform thing. Sega was actually in talks with Microsoft for Windows CE very early on, and they were actually developing it starting in 1996, the version of the Dreamcast operating system. They leaned into wanting to get a Windows operating system for the ease of development after all the complaints of the Saturn's development. So they went hardly in the other direction, right? Which the fact that it's Windows based might explain why so many Dreamcast games have been made available, at least on PC, if not other platforms.
Sure.
Um,
Well, you talk
so
you talk about the development, ease of development after the Saturn. And one of the things I learned when I was going through kind of the history was some of the bad blood from the Saturn involved them jumping up the timeline on the Saturn
mhm.
before the and so from what I understand, EA Sports basically said we're not going to release anything for the Dreamcast because you basically screwed us on the Saturn with the development timeline and cycle. So,
Yeah, the Saturn ended up releasing in North America 6 months ahead of when it was supposed to, and I think it was only a few months after the 32X had been released for the
mhm.
Genesis. So, like,
Another
not only did
success.
Sega blindside consumers and developers with the release of the Saturn so early outside of Japan, they blindsided Sega of America with
Yeah,
such an early release.
right.
Like, it was bad.
Yeah, yeah.
And
And
so,
coming off of the develop, I mean, here's the thing: is I learned that there was like basically like no confidence in Sega at all after the CD, the 32X, and then the Jaguar. And so, when we finally get to the Dreamcast, there was a lot of history.
well, the Jaguar wasn't Sega.
I'm
That's
sorry,
Atari.
I meant the Saturn. Sorry. I
Yeah.
the
Um,
boxes look similar, and so I always yeah.
yeah, I didn't realize that. To be fair, Kalinsky, the CEO of Sega America at the time of the Genesis and Sega CD, he did an amazing job with the hand he was dealt. He really did. He made Sega start eating up Nintendo's market share, right?
Mhm.
And then Sega Japan started to strong arm his decisions, being like, "No, we're not listening to you anymore," even though he had been screaming success at them the whole time. And they released the 32X, which he already thought was not a great idea with new hardware on the horizon.
Right.
And then they fast tracked the release of the Saturn so quickly after the 32X. He called it that consumers were going to be feel betrayed and
Right.
not have the money to get the Saturn. Like, it
Mhm.
was two-pronged attack from Sega Japan against themselves.
Right.
And when he was right, he was like, "I'm sorry, I'm out. You guys promised me I would have control over the North American arm of this, and you've taken that away from me. I'm out." That's why he left.
Mhm.
So then you end up getting Bernie Stoller in charge. And to be fair, he also kind of did the best he could with Sega of America.
Right.
But he was not quite as he was not as forward thinking as Tom Kalinske, I would
Mhm.
say. Instead, he was more of what you get from a traditional CEO: make cuts, make money. That was his
Right.
method, right? And, to the degree that Sega of America could, I can't really say it's a bad thing because they were hemorrhaging money, Sega in general. So with the release of the Dreamcast, I mean, it was ahead of everybody. It's the sixth generation console, right?
Sure.
The first sixth generation console.
Yep.
So they beat everybody to market. So much so they came out, I want to say over a year before PS2
In Japan, I think so. It might have only
and North
been
America.
was
And
it?
North America.
Okay. Okay.
We were still getting majorly staggered console releases at the time for everything. So it was still that way then. So the Dreamcast originally released in late 1998 in
Mhm.
Japan and late 99 in North America.
Right.
And honestly, the rest, Europe too, everywhere outside of Japan.
Right.
Um, and then PlayStation 2 released a year later in the West. So I don't know their specific timeline in everywhere else, but in
Mhm.
the West, I think it was a year later. And honestly, I knew a bunch of people. I was like, "Dude, you guys got to get Dreamcast. You got to get Dreamcast." And they were like, "I'm waiting for PS2."
And I want to talk a little bit about that because Sony really kind of did Sega dirty. Um, because we'd come out of the world of 8-bit to 16-bit to 32-bit, right? And now and And for some reason, it's stuck in everybody's brain that bits equaled quality, right?
Yeah.
And so Sega, or not Sega, Sony announced the PS2 as 128-bit. We don't have 128-bit processors today. We don't. Like, if you look at what they're talking about, it is doing Sega dirty, because it is still a 32-bit processor. It just happens to have 4 lanes for doing certain calculations, right?
Oh, so it's a multi-threaded processor
For certain calculations.
for certain. Oh my goodness! So it's basically blast processing.
Oh yes, yes. And so Sony, the what do they call it? The emotion engine or whatever it was that came out on the PS2. Yeah, they did the entire marketplace dirty by saying that this is a 128-bit processor. Like, it's not.
Wow.
Yeah, and so I mean, as I said, look at today. We're on 64 bits because honestly, we haven't seen a need for more at the moment, right? I mean, things are running plenty fast today at 64 bits, right? And so yeah, it was now that said, I think their graphics processor did run substantial. I think it had more vertices by an order of magnitude than the Dreamcast. That at least was there. But otherwise they really did do the Dreamcast dirty. By basically coming in and saying, whoa, everybody's talking 32 or 64-bit. We're now 128.
They pulled an Atari Jaguar on us.
Yeah, basically.
32 plus 32 is 64. Do the math.
You're right. Yeah, you can just run 4 lanes if you want. But if you actually look at their implementation of the RISC instruction set, it really only ever uses 64 bits of certain types of math. So, yeah.
Jeez.
Anyway.
What a mess.
Yeah. But at the same time, even though Sega with the Dreamcast had done a really good job of eating into the market, I think Sony still had something like 60% of the market with PS1. When the Dreamcast.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's pretty wild too. I do have a couple other things I want to talk about with the timeline, because there are 4 major Gen 6 consoles we tend to think of, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's Dreamcast, PS2, GameCube, and Xbox.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know that GameCube released 6 months after Dreamcast discontinued?
I did know that.
And Xbox released after that.
Right. I think I'm going to get your bingo cards out. That, I think, actually released right after the Dreamcast, right? Or was it just before? It was just before.
N64?
The 64 was a couple years before.
I think it was, I think it was still ahead of it. I want to say it was 95, 96,
I think it was 96, but I know that it was only a couple, when I say a couple years, it still is kind of considered like, because we were as you said, there were a lot of skip launches, right? Like there was a lot of staggered launches. And so when we talk, it may be considered a 5th generation, but that was the competition.
Yeah. N64 was mid to late 96.
Okay. But still, N64 was a competitor at the time still as well.
Mm-hmm.
So, and the N64 library, as long as you're in for janky 3D, is a great library.
This is true. The games I love on the N64 are a bit janky.
Uh-huh.
I love them just the same, but they're janky.
I'm with you.
Like the only one that's not really janky on the whole console is probably Mario Kart 64. And even then, there's a tiny bit.
Yeah, or the puzzle games. Like the Tetris game is still one of my favorites, as is Dr. Mario 64. I love that one.
So
yes.
I would say, the N64 was really the first console to make use of the 4 controller ports built in.
Mm-hmm.
The Dreamcast sort of, furthered that to make it standard. And then GameCube, Xbox, most things since, if they have controller ports, had 4.
Right.
until we went wireless, and then it didn't matter, right?
Yeah.
But even
And
then, they still tend to have a limit of 4 for the most part.
yeah, and I mean, I don't know many developers that make, games for more than 4, especially couch co-op, right?
Yeah.
Um, but that said, you bring that up because the PS2 came out,
Still only had 2.
still only had 2, and required the multi-tap.
Yeah.
So, I, in all honesty, the Dreamcast should have won. It really should have.
I mean, it had the bad press of what Sega had been doing for the years prior against it, which was a bummer because the Dreamcast, by all rights, was a great system. Was it underpowered compared to the other Gen 6 consoles? Absolutely.
Sure.
The Wii was underpowered compared to its generation. The Switch is underpowered compared to its generation. Hardware power does not equate to
Right.
success in the generation for the most part.
Right.
The problem is, I think at the time, gamers were a little less willing to they were very much like, I want the biggest and best. I even knew people who had Neo Geo because it was such a beast, and
Right.
just for that reason, like, oh, it's 24-bit, it's more powerful than the others. That's the one I wanted, right? And I'm like,
Yeah.
but what do you play? It's all fighting games, right? Like,
Yeah. We're back to the
not
bit
that
wars.
there's anything wrong with that, to quote Seinfeld by accident, but like, there's only so many fighting games I can play
Right.
before I want to play something else.
Right.
And honestly, the Dreamcast has a huge fighting game library, and as far as my game library goes, I probably had more fighting games for Dreamcast than any other platform, which is bizarre because the controller is terrible for fighting games,
Mm-hmm.
but the games are still great,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
So I suppose we could talk a little bit about the library for now before we come back to some of the hardware
Sure.
stuff.
Yeah.
So when I think Dreamcast, for me, the first game I always think of is Crazy Taxi.
Okay.
It was a big part of their advertising campaign, the initial advertising push. It was rolled out in arcades and on Dreamcast, and notoriously, it was essentially the exact same game, same hardware, same graphics, all that. You were getting arcade quality graphics on your TV, which is spectacular.
Right. I think that's an important call out. Is one of the big benefits to the Dreamcast was its parity with arcade, Virtua Fighter, Crazy Taxi, all of the Capcom versus SNK, or I mean, take your pick on the arcade titles, and really it was parity. Like, either I can go dump quarters or I can go buy a game and buy a Dreamcast, and I've got that environment at home.
Right. And while it was more commonplace in Japan than anywhere else, there were still markets where you could take your game from, usually with fighting games, you could take characters that you had built and data you had created through your home console, drag this little VMU memory card to the arcade and plug it in and have your home stats at the arcade, which is super cool. Like, that's not really something you've seen before or since, I would say. Sega was always trying to reinvent the wheel, and Nintendo gets a lot of shit for that, but they still manage it and keep a successful business.
Right.
But Sega gets shit for it and gets looked down on for it, which I don't understand. They're always just a little ahead of the curve, maybe just a little too far ahead of the curve to where nobody's ready to embrace the tech just yet. You know what I mean? Like, it's not even early adopter ready.
Right. Yeah, the VMU was a great. I mean, let's talk about the VMU since you just pulled it out. The visual memory unit.
This little guy.
Yeah, it has a controller on it.
Yeah,
and during gameplay, it'll show either a logo or maybe something to do with the game itself. And some games would dump a little game ROM onto it that you could play.
Yeah, there was the Chows from Sonic Adventure. It was a virtual pet. There was the little treasure hunting adventure game from Skies of Arcadia.
Mm-hmm.
Like it had some cool stuff. I think there was something with Seaman too, but I don't remember what it was offhand.
Yeah. Wasn't there a mini game with Bomberman online? No, because that was online. Anyway, um, the other thing that you could do with it, and this is something we still don't have. Well, we don't need it anymore, but this is something we still don't have is connecting two together and transferring your save games.
Oh yeah, like that was super cool to me. Is you'd have little
Yeah.
stuff where you just take two of them
Uh-huh.
and take those ports
Yeah.
and plunk them together, and there you go, and you can transfer data. They can
Yep.
interact, whatever that particular file does.
Yep. Yeah. I mean
Which I always thought was cool.
yeah, I loved the VMU. I thought it was great. The problem is it also did make the memory modules expensive, right?
Yes, it did. But it's funny because the VMU was such a good idea. Sony copied it for the
Mm-hmm.
PS1.
Mm-hmm.
But we never saw it in North America. It was a Japan only release. But I think Final Fantasy VIII made use of it as well as some other games.
I'm
And
glad Char's not here.
I know, right? But at the same time, there's not a whole lot to be done with a visual memory unit,
Right.
that isn't in the controller, right?
Absolutely. But it's
it's sitting there across the room plugged into the PlayStation above the controller port.
Right.
You're not making active use of it during gameplay. But I mean, it's still the virtual pet, take it on the go aspect of it was there.
Well, and kind of another kind of semi copy, not exactly the same copy, but on the GameCube, the link to the link cable to the the Game Boy Advance,
GBA.
right? Yeah, like that feels very much a similar kind of, because I remember playing one of the Zelda games and having GBA attached.
Four Swords Adventure,
and you get the map or you get whatever on the GBA.
Oh,
right?
I
think
Wind Waker did that. I think, but there was another Zelda game for the GameCube that required GBAs for everybody to play.
Yeah.
Because it was up to 4-player Zelda. So y'all had to have your own screen if you left the main screen and went into a cave or something. And y'all played with like a Game Boy Advance controller.
Right.
As your controller for a GameCube game, right? Like that's silly.
Which also feels
but it was
like
fun.
It feels like they once again copied that for the Wii U. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
A little bit.
Yeah.
Not quite the same because you just have one gamepad instead of a bunch, but
yeah,
it's the same kind of idea. But it's funny because I was looking at these earlier and thought about the comparison between the Game Boy and the VMU, and they're very similar in style, which is just funny to me.
I gotta wonder what the resolution difference is, because the Game Boy, the original Game Boy, notoriously had a low resolution screen, right? Like,
yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah.
Anyway. I used to know it offhand because I used to draw little cartoons that I'd load into the VMU and share with people. Oh, the VMU is very little.
Is it? Okay. So
yeah, it's
very low res.
Yeah, it looks like, oh my goodness. If this is to be believed, it's 96 by 64.
I can believe that. Of course, I have my smartwatch today that's the same screen size that's like, substantially higher density.
It's smaller than that. It's 48 by 32.
Wow. Okay.
So it's very little resolution, but for the games you were playing on it, you didn't need a whole lot.
Sure.
Because they were simple. Like it was basically a step up from Tiger handhelds, right? As far as the quality of the game.
Yep. But how cool was it also, even if it didn't have the screen and the controller, how cool is it also to have your memory module in your controller, right? Like, now that I think, that kind of started with the 64, right? Because the 64 had
Yeah.
Yeah.
The N64 had the memory card in the controller.
The Rumble Pack as well that you could get.
And it only had one slot, right? So you either had the memory card or the Rumble Pack, not both. So you'd be hot swapping for like some games where you'd like, I want the Rumble while I'm playing, but I need to be able to save later if the game didn't have a save on the cartridge, right?
Right. Which is funny
So
because I think it's a Mad Catz. I have a Rumble Pack that has the memory module in it, and Nintendo never built that, but the third parties did. So,
yeah,
yeah,
I do remember that actually. But I think I knew somebody who had one like that, and the rumble eventually caused the memory card to stop working.
I can believe it.
But
Yeah.
you got the two slots here. So I'm going to bring this
Yes.
up for people to see if they're unfamiliar. You got two slots. So you could double stack the VMU
Mm-hmm.
or non-screen memory cards from third parties. You got the Rumble Pack you slide in,
Mm-hmm.
or, other games made use of other things like Seaman used the microphone. And I know like the microphone cover on this thing is disgusting at this point. Pay no attention to that. But you got the microphone so you could talk to the games that had had voice control. And then if you were like me and at the time still using shit like Game Genie and Game Shark, plug the Game Shark into the second slot.
There you go. Okay, let's talk. You brought up Seaman. Let's talk Seaman, because that is an odd game for sure. I never had it.
It's games like Seaman that make me love Dreamcast as much as I do.
Yeah, let's talk
It's
about
all
that.
the weird shit games, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, so the Dreamcast game library, even in North America, is a very Japanese library. And I mean that in the best way possible. Like,
Sure.
it's all quirky and bizarre and fun types of games that are just oozing charisma and style and what the fuckery, right?
Yes.
So I remember, so I have a big list of games here, and I'm sure a lot of you listening have at least played one or some of these. But I mentioned Crazy Taxi already, so we can skip past the Crazy Taxi games. We're on Seaman now. So Seaman was this bizarre game where it was like a virtual pet on just steroids and crack at the same time, right?
Yes.
You raise this little fish that you're talking to, and it starts talking to you. And it goes through various stages of metamorphosis where, like, it's a bunch of them, and then one of them eats the rest of them and becomes like it grows more and it starts having conversations with you. And like it sounds like a toddler at the beginning when it first starts talking. And by the end, it's having full blown conversation. Well, sort of full blown, as much as a full blown conversation could be from a game from 1999,
Right.
2000, but it would actually remember things you told it, right? It was like a Furby, but creepier.
And narrated by Leonard Nimoy.
Yes. So he'd give you updates to your terrarium every time you turned it on the next day. He'd be like, all right, he'd give you a little more backstory about the Seaman and what you've understood from it thus far, because weirdly enough, there was a ton of lore behind Seaman. It was intended to be 4 games.
Mm-hmm.
And oh man, hearing the story of what those games were supposed to be is just wild to me. Because it was supposed to be Seaman and then his wife, right? Because let's get into the weeds here a little bit. And I'm going to spoil Seaman for those of you who've not played it. I'm sorry. If you haven't played it by now, you probably aren't gonna. It's been 22 years. So he's this man from ancient Egypt, basically. And his lover were both turned into animals, cursed by a wizard to live out their lives as a creature of the sky and a creature of the sea until they can meet up and fall in love again to break the curse.
So it's a
And
little
I know
bit
this
of
is
it's what was that movie that Matthew Broderick, Lady Hawk. It's a little Lady Hawkish.
yeah, I guess so. So the only one we got was Seaman 1. There were supposed to be 2 or 3 Seamans and then also one for the woman.
Mm-hmm.
So you evolve Seaman through various courses until he's something larger. At the end of the first game, it ends with him being a frog or toad, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he does tell you some of this stuff throughout that game. Some of it I read about later after the games ended up never happening. So the plot was just kind of put out there by the developers, like, this is what we wanted to do. We're sorry we couldn't. And that was supposed to be a pretty wild connection of games where you move from one game to the next, and then you go to the other side of it and move through those until you can make them join together as one again and get the final ending.
Mm.
Probably kind of convoluted and long and drawn out, but a really cool idea.
Now,
Had the Dreamcast succeeded, we might have seen more of them.
Now, did I miss that? Did I miss you saying that it eventually is a fish with a human face on it?
Yeah, so the fish thing happens like that's about midway through, early on to midway through, until it finally evolves into a frog.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's this creature the whole time has a human face and it's creepy as hell.
Mm-hmm.
It's off-putting to say the least. But it's funny how it has these conversations with you, and sometimes it gives you a nice good ribbing, right?
Uh-huh.
And like the one I always remember was he asked me at one point, "Do you like yourself?" Which is a pretty, that's a pretty contemplative question to ask somebody in general.
Sure.
And I was like, "Yeah, I like myself." And he's like, "I'm sure you do. I bet you like yourself at least 3 times a day." And I was like, "Oh, dude."
They know their audience. They know the age group of their audience.
I had friends over. They saw that happen. See, man, you're embarrassing me.
That's fantastic. Well, in their head, they're all going, yeah, I do the same thing.
Oh, we all died in a fit of laughing that day. It was
That's
great.
Awesome. Yep.
But then you get another major release for the Dreamcast was Shenmue, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That was supposed to be this huge thing. And the gameplay was to me, it always struck me as a sort of open world RPG Virtua Fighter.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't know if that's what the original intent was, but that's how it came across to me because the fighting felt very Virtua Fighter to me. Except you're running around an open world game, exploring, getting to know the neighbors, getting to know the people in your town, spending hours at the arcade playing, just Super Hang On and Pole Position, whatever they've got there. Afterburner, Space Harrier, I think. And then, you have to go to work, do jobs to make money, to pay the rent at the end of the month and stuff like that. It is a very strange game, right?
Art imitates life.
Yeah. And I mean, we see games do that all the time now, but at the time that was not commonplace.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. While we're talking notable games, I mean, of course, Sonic Adventure, right?
Yeah.
We talked about, or I mentioned, the Capcom versus SNKs. I think there was also, there were fighting games galore on the system.
Yeah, there was Marvel Capcom. There was King of Fighters 98, King of Fighters 99, Garou Mark of the Wolf. Oh my goodness, there's so many.
Yeah. I mentioned Bust a Move earlier, which I love the Bust a Move games. I kind of wish we'd see a resurgence of them. The little shoot the bubble, the right colored bubble.
Puzzle bubble.
Yeah, puzzle bubble. Yeah. I love those
I think
games.
they ended up not being able to call it Bust a Move anymore after a point. And ended up having to release them as Puzzle Bobble later.
Gotcha. And then one I mentioned, I talked to you about this before we started discussing before we started the podcast, but Rez, R-E-Z, still to this day, like I had forgotten about it until I looked at a list and I was like, oh my gosh, that game was memorable. It's a rail shooter. So, very much like Panzer Dragoon, or I don't know how many other rail shooters do we have these days. In fact, honestly, to me, I would kind of view the modern take on Rez as Beat Saber, like almost like, in VR, but this was, it looked very cyberpunky. In fact, I think it had kind of a cyberpunk story behind it, but the story was only really told through the gameplay, which was really cool. The boss battles were incredible. It was a musical rail shooter, so you made music by destroying things. And of course, there's an underlying beat going, and which there were a series of games that came out. Oh, I don't know, 10 or whatever years ago. They were retro likes, and I can't remember, but they all were musically based, if I remember. There was like one where you were a running dude.
Oh yeah, Bit Trip.
Yes, yeah. So it's like a 3D version of Bit Trip almost, So yeah, Rez was great. And of course you can't not mention Gauntlet Legends. I mean, I think that might have been my first interaction with Gauntlet Legends was on the Dreamcast.
Now that was on N64 as well, if I'm not mistaken.
But I did not have it on N64.
So I did not play it on Dreamcast. I played it on N64.
Okay.
Which might have turned me away from the game for a very long time.
Did it have the voiceovers in it? Red Wizard needs food badly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It had all that.
Uh-huh. Yeah. So yeah, the system for its time period had a hell of a library. It really did.
It really did. Yeah. It had Skies of Arcadia, which is widely regarded as one of the best JRPGs, which some people like that distinction, some people don't, but it makes it easier to understand what it is. It's widely regarded as one of the best RPGs of all time. You ended up getting Code Veronica, Resident Evil Code Veronica. We've not even seen re-released outside of the Dreamcast, which is a bummer because that game was, I'm pretty sure, like one of the best received Resident Evils to date.
Yeah.
And we've not seen it again, right? We've seen mention of it in other games. Resident Evil 5 mentions Veronica at points, but we don't, a lot of people never got to play it because a lot of people didn't own the Dreamcast, right?
Right. Yeah. And then there was also an Alone in the Dark game. And I think it was kind of a modern take on the, like it kind of was like a reboot of the what's the
Alone
subtitle?
in the Dark, The New Nightmare.
Yeah. And it was
I've heard this is good. I've never played it. I picked it up for $10 on clearance.
I played a bunch of it. I never finished it, but I did play a bunch of it when I still have my Dreamcast. It's just out in my garage. So and then there was a game that I absolutely adored. It was funny because you hear, like, there's a term that's thrown around really since the days of cell phones now, right? The casual game, right? And
yeah.
And so there was a billiards game on the Dreamcast that I played for hours because it was just one of those casual, like I can spin it up when I need to. It didn't have any sort of need to remember a story, but it was called Maximum Billiards and it was awesome. So that was one of my favorites.
Not played that one. I do have some other games listed. I've got like Choo Choo Rocket, which was a really wild sort of, is kind of somewhere between a puzzle game and an arcade game. It's like, oh gosh, how do you even describe it? It's such a bizarre puzzle game if you haven't played it. It's like tactical Pac-Man, I guess, is a good way to describe it. And there were modes of it that were up to 4-player, where the idea was to get all the mice to your rocket ship and send all the cats to everybody else's rocket ships.
Entertaining.
And so this was all like you'd set down arrows and direct things, and your arrow would expire after a time or after you placed so many.
Right.
And then for the puzzle version for single player, it was actually challenges to solve. How do you get the mice safely to the rocket ship without sending the cat to the rocket or sending the cat to eat any of the mice? So you had to go around these puzzles. And not only that, but you could make your own and share them online. And my buddy and I did that too. So we'd share puzzles with each other.
Oh,
like, hey,
nice.
you got to try out this one. Oh, no, you got to try out this one. And we came up with some really cool puzzles. And
awesome.
That was a lot of fun for me. And then you get the weirder stuff like Space Channel 5.
Never played that one.
It's just this really, really wild space adventure. You're playing as a journalist, covering an alien invasion at a spaceport. Musically, she's singing the whole thing, dancing along. You get Michael Jackson involved, but he's never directly mentioned as Michael Jackson. He's called Space Michael.
That's awesome.
And like it's all very retro futuristic looking. Like, you know, it looks like the Jetsons kind of style, but in 3D. So it's a really wild look. And then you get there's another one that I remember, it was huge when it came out, Samba de Amigo. This was one that people were like, oh my gosh, Samba de Amigo, because it was a rhythm game, but you actually used maracas and had to move with the beat to different positions. I mean, it's Just Dance, right?
Right.
But it's Just Dance well before Just Dance happened.
Yeah. Yeah, the library was a great library. But while we're talking about the library, we can kind of start talking a little bit about the downfall and one of the problems with the system that I think was a massive contributor was they thought that they were going to be just fine using GD-ROMs, which were the dual layer CD-ROMs, but most games didn't end up actually using the full gigabyte of space. And so once people basically figured out how to rip this, the system read CD-ROMs just fine.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so there was a huge piracy market, and it made it hard to sell the games.
It read CD-ROM so well that I don't know if you remember this emulator called Bleem. It was basically one of the first commercial emulators, right?
Right.
And that's because it could emulate PlayStation. So this was a big deal at the time. And they actually released some, they had bigger, grander intentions for the Dreamcast, but they were going to come out with Bleemcast, Bleempex. Like they were really good on this Bleem name, right? And they were initially supposed to support, you know, up to around about 100 titles, give or take, because it just took so much space on the disc to handle that. But they were unable to do that for numerous reasons. One of which is they kept getting sued into oblivion by Sony at every turn. So they only released 3, and they were each for an individual game. Now they were only $6 a pop. So if you didn't have these were, you know, hot ticket games. It was Gran Turismo 2, Metal Gear Solid, and Tekken 3. So if you didn't have a PlayStation, those $18 were a lot cheaper to buy those PlayStation games and play them at double the resolution on a Dreamcast than on a PlayStation. So the Bleemcast actually ran PlayStation games. You know, it could emulate PlayStation games well and make them look prettier. That's wild.
For sure. For sure. Yeah. So there was the piracy aspect. And then I think the other thing that kind of killed it is the PlayStation 2 came out and was a DVD player as well.
Yeah. That was the big nail in the coffin for a lot of things, honestly.
Absolutely. It's one of the reasons that it was when did Blu-ray hit PlayStation 3 or 4?
3.
Yeah. Like once again, you know, Sony comes out and says, "Hey, why do you need to buy other media players when we've got, you know, a built-in Blu-ray player?" You know.
If I'm not mistaken, the PS2 was sort of the final nail in the coffin for DivX as well, right?
Very likely. DivX was a weird format anyway. So
yeah, but I do remember DivX being kind of out in the world pretty regularly up until that point, and then DivX just sort of petered away because everybody had a PS2, so everybody had a DVD player, so they didn't need DivX. They could just buy DVDs, right? And then, yeah, it was a real bummer that PlayStation 2 just decimated. Pardon me, the Dreamcast as much as it did. And
yeah,
I still feel like the PS2 did not handle a lot of things as well as the Dreamcast did. Multiplayer, not as easy.
Right.
The you know, online, not
Mm-hmm.
as easy. I know you had your issues with it, but to be fair, for the most part, it was quite accessible and more. I would venture to say it was pretty damn consistent with your online connection.
Well, let's kind of go back then, because the Dreamcast came with a modem,
Mhm.
and in the American market, it was a 56K modem, and yep, and not at launch, but at some point, not too far out, they launched the Dreamcast Online service that was a
The
dial-up,
SegaNet.
a SegaNet that was a dial-up internet service, as long with
I
games.
I was actually a subscriber to SegaNet.
I was going to
I had an
ask you
email
that.
address with SegaNet.
That was the note I took earlier before we started. Was I was going to ask if you ever used the online service. So
I did.
okay, and I know it had web browsing. Um,
Mhm.
and so yeah, right off the bat, like very easy for the online service. And then I'm going to tell my little story because this is, I've told this story before on the podcast, but I actually looked up the details. So, um, unbeknownst to me, after I got my Dreamcast, there were two uh, network adapters that were released, and I didn't understand the difference. There was the LAN adapter, and there was the broadband adapter, which to me, being an internet nerd, this is my bread and butter in my job all day long. LAN adapter and broadband adapter to me feel like they do the same work, right?
Yeah, right?
Yeah. So now, okay, LAN adapter, sure, local area network, but like what LAN adapter does not talk to the internet when you have an internet gateway, right? I mean,
Yeah, that's
so to tell my story, I've told this before, but to tell my story, so I bought my Dreamcast after they'd announced that the Dreamcast was being discontinued. So I think I got the $50 Dreamcast, and super high value for $50, even if it had been discontinued, right? But I basically looked at it and I wanted the broadband adapter. Well, I wanted to be able to use my home internet, which we were a bunch of nerds. We had wired internet.
yeah.
And so I go onto eBay, because they weren't selling these anymore because of the discontinued. I go onto eBay and I buy a LAN adapter. I get said LAN adapter. I plug it in. I connect it up. I get link. I get an IP address. Everything looks great. I go grab my Quake 3 Arena disc and plug it in and spin it up, and no online play.
Ah,
So I finally start researching this, and I find out I bought the wrong one. I bought the LAN adapter, not the broadband adapter. So literally, they were HIT 300 and HIT 400. I bought the 300. I needed the 400. Which, by the way, there were 9 U.S. titles that were supported, including Phantasy Star Online, Quake 3 Arena, and Unreal Tournament. But so I became so aggravated with this thing. One evening, I was so mad at it. I was trying to like hack it and do this, that, and the other. And finally, I pulled this thing off of the Dreamcast. I don't even think I plugged the modem back in, so it just had that chunk missing on the bottom. I had a sliding door. It was winter. I opened the sliding door. I winged it out into the yard. I know I've told you this story before, but for those that haven't heard it, I wing it out into the yard, and I'm frustrated, and I walk away, and probably said some words. So come the summer, things have melted and it's time to mow the lawn, and I'm out there mowing the lawn, and I've forgotten that I've thrown this adapter out into the yard, and I hear and I hear this like this something go flying. So I chase this thing down, and I mean, the thing was still mostly intact, because it, like, all of it was like internal, like, metal shielding and everything. But yeah,
yeah.
I'd driven over this adapter with my lawnmower, and honestly, it felt really good. It felt really good driving over it with my lawnmower. So anyway, I never had the 400 broadband adapter. I don't know if you do.
I did. I sold it a couple years ago for like
Okay.
$150 or something, because I was
Yeah,
like, oh, I don't use it anymore. Somebody else wants to pay that? Sure, they can pay it.
yeah. Now I did look. There's a wiki that kind of goes over the online games that you can use, and there are some services that have taken up hosting so that you can continue to play some of these games. It looks pretty awesome, honestly. There's like you can play Phantasy Star Online even to this day.
Yeah,
Yeah, so that's really cool.
it's pretty awesome. I think that's really cool. Fantasy Star Online was one of those games that as soon as it came, like, I want to say that came out around the same time as Diablo 2.
Mm,
For a lot of people, it was Diablo 2. For me, it was Fantasy Star Online.
nice, nice. Yeah,
Many, many nights where I stayed up well past the night playing Fantasy Star Online in my high school years.
I bet. I bet. I never played Phantasy Star Online. I probably should have, but I never did. So it was kind of EverQuesty, wasn't it?
I've never played EverQuest. I don't know,
Okay. Maybe a little
but
World of Warcrafty.
not so much. It was really about the gear grind, and it had a sort of randomly generated floor based on parts that could interconnect, and so the floors would be differently shaped,
Mm.
or it might be the same shape floor, but the doors would be blocked in different ways so that the labyrinth had changed somehow, stuff like that.
Okay.
And depending on the mission or whether you were just playing openly, would determine what kind of floor plans you would get, and then what kind of monsters would spawn in the area for that particular mission, or if you were just playing the main story.
Okay.
So it was all about finding loot, powering up your weapons, getting new weapons, finding new loot to power those up, and so forth. So it was more like I thought of it as closer to Diablo because of the loot grind.
Okay. But not isometric, right? Or was it
Not
isometric?
isometric.
Okay.
It was sort of not necessarily over the shoulder, but behind the avatar.
Okay.
And you could zoom in and out a bit, I think, if I remember correctly. But yeah, you had different styles of play. There was a caster, there was rangers, and then there was hunters. So either you used melee weapons, you used magic, or you used ranged weapons.
Okay. Yeah, it sounds a little bit, at least the behind the shoulder and having the different class types, it does sound a little EverQuesty to me there. So yeah. Well, nice. Yeah. So but that was my story with the broadband adapter. Well, I'm sorry, the LAN adapter.
The what was supposed to be a broadband adapter.
Right. Right. So what else
And then
you got?
like it's the keyboard and mouse.
Mm.
Since we were just talking about the internet, you got take that microphone.
Mhm.
You got the keyboard branded with SegaNet. Oh, wrong side. Here we go. And then you got the Dreamcast mouse, right?
Yeah.
And they were intended for playing, like for using the web browser. But there were games that made use of them as well. You could play Unreal or Quake with the keyboard and mouse, which was super cool. So like it, and being because I always wanted to like sort of host people a little bit, I would, and at the time I was not a PC gamer. I didn't have a PC. So, well, I did, but I didn't play a whole lot of games on it yet. So when my friends would come over and we didn't have enough controllers, I would play with the keyboard and mouse for Unreal and Quake.
Very
and
nice.
You might call it cheating, but I wiped the walls with them if I played with just the keyboard.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I remember one time I was playing with my buddies and we were sitting on a couch, right? So I couldn't use the mouse. So I've got this just hanging against my knees and I was playing like that, right? And I was just kicking ass with it hanging on my knees. And they're like, how the hell are you so good at this? Playing Quake 3. It was great.
That's awesome.
But then another game that I still haven't had the heart to get rid of is Typing of the Dead. I love that game. It's so stupid. It's so cheesy as far as the storytelling goes, because it's just House of the Dead, but everybody's running around with a keyboard strapped to their chest and a Dreamcast on their back, right? It's so silly. And you just type in words. It's basically a typing tutor that's
right.
not doing a great job of teaching you so much as stressing you the fuck out.
Right.
But that's what it is. Like, that's honestly, that's how I first learned to type. I didn't have any typing classes in school yet. I played that and I got good at typing because of that. And then because I had a PC, I would talk on AOL with my friends and stuff, but this is what got me quick at typing. It was not AOL.
Yeah, I was gonna say I had Mavis Beacon teach us typing, and then typing in school in junior high. I never got to play, Typing of the Dead, but I know of it for sure. So
I love that game. Yeah. I still have it on my shelf back there. It's one of those games I've just not been willing to part with yet.
That's awesome.
And then, another great RPG on the Dreamcast, which has been re-released, but I think it's never been done quite as well as the original. Grandia 2. It's gotten re-releases. It got a re-release on PS2, and I guess it was glitchy and didn't run as well, which is weird, seeing as it had 5 times the space and a more powerful hardware.
128 bits, my friend.
Yeah. But I mean, it still was way more powerful than the Dreamcast, but it didn't run it as well. It was glitchy and broken. But yeah, that was one of those RPGs that I still think fondly on and loved it. And then Evolution was kind of a weird RPG, but that was, it did well enough to get a sequel in that short time that the Dreamcast existed. And then one of my all-time favorites, Jet Set Radio, or Jet Grind Radio.
Yes.
And so many of these games have rocking soundtracks, but then you get to Jet Set Radio and oh my goodness, that soundtrack was banging the whole time, right? And it was like, it was like Japanese techno and European techno. It was just all this weird music I had never heard before. And then Rob Zombie's Dragula, which was so out of place.
Yep.
But I mean, it was such a good game. I actually initially played the Japanese release. My uncle burned a copy of the Japanese one and gave it to me. And so I played that well before Jet Set Radio came out, or Jet Grind Radio came out. So that's why I always call it Jet Set Radio, right? It's like the initial version of Final Fantasy VII. It said Aerith everywhere. It wasn't Aerith yet.
Right.
So to me, she's always Aerith. I don't give a shit.
Right.
So that game is Jet Set Radio. And even Sega agrees with me because later they made Jet Set Radio Future. So
I was going to say they did bring the Jet Set Radio name to the US eventually. So
yeah. But that was such a cool game. It was so different from anything I'd played before that. It was another game that just oozed style. It was cel shaded. It was fast. It was fun. It was funky. Oh man, absolutely. If you've not played Jet Set Radio, please play Jet Set Radio. Get it on sale on Steam or something. It's amazing.
Absolutely. Well, I want to touch on, for those that, may not have been able to play the library or have the library and don't have the hardware anymore to play it. I was using an emulator earlier this week to kind of refresh a little bit. The one I was using was called Flycast, and it just kind of like the discussion we had last week where we talked about some emulation and some like the Metroid Prime emulation. It does things like upscaling and some anti-aliasing and whatnot, and it's a really nice product. In case you wanted to say, try Jet Set Radio or Jet Grind Radio or try Res or try Typing of the Dead or or hey,
Code Veronica.
Code Veronica. I was going to say Code Veronica since we don't have a re-release of that. So, but yeah, I tried Flycast. I know that there's another one out there that I haven't tried, and then I think that there's an implementation in RetroArch for one of them.
I don't know what emulator it is that I have, but I have it on my RetroPie.
Okay.
and it plays the games really well.
Yeah.
I've not noticed any issues yet with any of the things I've played on it, but I've not played a ton. Like I used it for Crazy Taxi because it's easier than hooking up the Dreamcast upstairs and dragging
Right.
it back downstairs and whatever. The little box and an HDMI cord goes a long way.
Yes. Well, and the nice thing about the Dreamcast is your button layout is the same as, say an Xbox 360 controller, right?
It is, isn't it?
Yes.
Even more so that the Xbox is just the same lineage as the Dreamcast, right? It
Yeah.
really is.
Yeah. In fact, I think even the D-pad and the analog stick are in the same positions, top to bottom, if I remember right. Isn't the
Yeah, they
D-pad?
are.
Yeah. So I mean, yeah. Oh, while we're talking controllers, my one complaint about the Dreamcast is the cable position on that controller.
Yeah, we did not mention this. So I've actually got some interesting controller tidbits regarding
Yeah.
the Dreamcast that I'd like to talk about. But yeah, the first one is the weirdness that is the controller coming out of the bottom instead of the top. But then they made this to make it wing up and pretend it comes out of the top, right? And I think the biggest hurdle here is just the fact that the VMU ports are right there. So it makes it kind of hard to do anything.
I get
And
it, but
controller assembly, while you could run it through the back of the controller,
Mhm.
it would make the controller harder to assemble, right?
Right, but I'm thinking offset it and just have it come out at one side or the other, beside the VMU
That's
port,
true.
right? I mean, because
Yeah, I
yeah,
guess they could have had it come out like either here or
yeah,
here, and it would have been
right,
fine. You make
yeah,
a good point.
or they have the little like position where you can pull it up and pin it in. Why not just have it come out of the bottom of the memory port where you? Anyway, yeah.
Yeah,
So,
but they actually, here's a fun story. So Knights originally came out on the Saturn, right?
mhm.
And Yuji Naka, who was working on Sonic Adventure at the time for the upcoming Dreamcast, when they were still coming out with the original designs of the controller, the Dreamcast was actually supposed to get a sort of Wii remote
Really?
with a gyro in it.
Hmm.
It was supposed to get a Knights game that was going to use what was basically a wired Wii remote.
Hmm.
Kind of wild. I did not
Yeah.
know that until today, actually. But
Huh.
again, Sega, always a little too far ahead of the curve, right?
Right. 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 Well,
They even had a weird offset controller where the left side was bigger than the right.
oh, weird.
GameCube, anybody?
Yeah. Yeah. So, you bring up by the way, I saw a review on the GameCube or on the Dreamcast controller that I remember. I actually need to get my Dreamcast out of my garage, but I kind of remember this feeling when I was playing it when I had it. It squishes your hands linearly into, and that's one of the complaints is if you're gripping it's not, it like forces you into a non-ergonomic position.
Yeah,
Modern
it's
controllers, pull you out, right?
two
Yeah.
very vertical positions
Yeah.
here.
Where a modern controller, your hands naturally, just kind of, yeah. So, but it very much is kind of it resembles the Saturn. What's the Saturn? What was the controller that was,
The Saturn 3D
yeah,
controller. It
yeah.
was
Mhm.
pretty much an updated version of this monstrosity.
Yes. Yeah.
And like that was partly by design because it handled the analog pretty well, but it did the same damn thing where it's very vertical control. Like
Yeah.
the Dreamcast is just a softer design of this thing, right?
Right.
With two less buttons
Right. Speaking
for whatever reason.
Speaking of handling, the if I read today that um the analog stick uses what are they? What's it called? There's the alternate analog sticks you can buy for this the Steam Deck that use a particular technology that's less prone to the drift. What's that term? Um, and the Dreamcast
Not
actually
sure.
used it. Hang on. Um, Hall
That's
sensors.
interesting.
Hall sensors. It uses Hall sensors.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I never realized it, but I'm pretty sure my Dreamcast controllers are still in full functioning order.
Mm-hmm.
And honestly, my controllers got swapped a lot. Like, and by
Mm-hmm.
swapped, I mean I would pull the case from one and
Mm-hmm.
swap it to another
Mm-hmm.
so that I had two-tone controllers because I would buy controllers that were different colors and then sort of, Oreo them to where it was two colors instead of just one, so it was more interesting looking.
That's great.
But that way also when I went to my friend's house, because I did have some friends with Dreamcast, if I brought controllers, we would not wonder which one was mine, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, that's my controller. There I go.
Right. Right. But yeah, from what I understand, the analog sticks on the analog stick on the Dreamcast used Hall sensors, which are like if you go buy the updated or the third party sticks for the Steam Deck, they're Hall sensors. They're much more accurate than the potentiometers. So
Why is that not a thing that's more traditionally used in analog
I
controllers?
think it's just more expensive. So
Hmm.
yeah, Hall effect is what they call them, Hall effect sensors. So
I wonder
um,
if it's too big for the Switch or if Nintendo's just penny pinching.
uh, you know,
Because the space inside the Joy-Con is very small,
it
so
is.
I wonder if it's maybe just too small for that. Because
Yeah.
I don't know if you've opened up a Joy-Con, but
No.
the footprint of that analog stick is itty bitty.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I mean you can see it just looking at looking at the post. It's like, yeah. Yeah. So, it was you're right, it was ahead of its time in a lot of ways, but at the same time, Sega also makes like in some ways they're ahead of their time, but they also make some really interesting choices that are kind of like the 32X, right? Like it it was almost a well, how do we make a 32-bit console without making a 32-bit console, right? Like how do we kind of cheat and get halfway there, you know? And so
Yeah.
um
I I honestly think that's part of the reason that people didn't adopt the Dreamcast is
mhm,
because like it was too many steps in the wrong direction for people to recognize a step in the right direction
mhm,
from the company, right?
yeah.
And I think a lot of people only bought a Dreamcast once it was $50 because it was discontinued, right? I, I I know. I think I bought two at that point on top of the one I already had because and I don't know if this is a problem you ever ran into. I burned out the motor on my Dreamcast, and I suspect it's because of all the pirated games I would play.
Mm,
I would play burned games. I would play the NES emulator on it, right?
mm,
The and that's something we didn't talk too much on, but yeah, you could emulate other consoles on this
right.
thing. We talked about the PlayStation, but NES, I think Super Nintendo was okay depending on the game. Genesis, Master
Mhm,
System, you could play all these on the Dreamcast, which was really cool.
right.
And it would just be a self-booting disc after a point anyway.
Right.
And that was really rad.
Yeah. Yeah,
But
I have a lot of fond memories of it. And sadly I did buy mine too late. I really did. As much as I loved it, I bought it after they'd announced, right? And maybe if I'd bought it before, maybe it would have survived, right? There were a lot of us
and
that were that way.
even then, I think it was already pretty cheap most of the time.
Yeah.
Well before it was discontinued, I think it was $100.
Mm-hmm.
And I think its launch price was maybe 170, 150. It wasn't high. It was cheap for a new console. I do remember that.
Well, you remember the whole 99.99 thing, um, right? And they actually like would discount to 99.99 because of the release date. Like some places would do that so that to as kind of a loss leader to get you in, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, and so you the opening line that you used, most people aren't going to get that. I got it. Maybe you should
Okay,
talk about
so
that.
yeah, that was part of the major advertising push for the console, where at the end of the commercials or at the beginning, depending on the particular spot you saw, you would hear a whisper of, it's thinking. And the idea was that the technology was so far above what the previous consoles all were that it was just like it was essentially AI compared to the other tech, right? It
Right.
was so much smarter than the other tech. And to a degree that is true, but I actually knew a lot of people who misinterpreted it and thought that the games would learn based on your play style to
Right.
adapt to that
Right.
and play back. And thinking back on that, like that's kind of dumb because that's up to each developer to incorporate something like that or not. The console's
Right.
not just going to know what the hell's going on in the game.
Yep.
But that's one of those teenage dumb things. It's like, oh, I know nothing about consoles, but this must
Right.
be what that means,
Right. Well, I also remember because these were like these were like basically telling you like it's coming, it's thinking, whatever. And I was thoroughly confused by those commercials, honestly. Like,
Really?
if you go watch those commercials, it's, I mean, it was very 90s, it was I don't know. It felt like a lesser version of the, Sega does what Nintendo don't. Right?
Yeah, I mean, at least it wasn't as bizarre as the Saturn commercials where you just had like some shaved head woman sitting in the corner with like a ring around her head, muttering gibberish.
Yeah. Yeah. 90s advertising, man. It was a different time.
But I mean, some of the commercials were just as simple as it would cycle through a bunch of cast members from various games and then zoom out of the the little LED gem on the front of the Dreamcast and then show the whole Dreamcast, and then you'd get the whisper of its thinking.
Maybe
So it was they weren't all out there like that, but
maybe I'm mixing up the Saturn ones with the Dreamcast ones.
Perhaps.
I remember
a lot of the Dreamcast ones really leaned on the 3D animation of like cinematic quality models from the games to create the commercials but I mean, oh man, there's one commercial, the Japanese Choo Choo Rocket commercial. That song from that commercial is still stuck in my head. I can sing most of it. And I know the English translation of it, which is even better.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
So it goes like choo choo rocket to nekriotate choo choo rocket to neko
which is,
and it translates to, oh man, I just forgot it. I just had it in my head, but basically it's like choo choo rocket, save all the mice. Choo choo rocket, avoid the cats. Choo choo rocket, the rocket is awesome. I am high. Like, it's so weird.
I'm high. Wow.
Yeah.
Well. I mean, whoever made that game probably was.
Yeah, I mean, it got released on GBA, so it did well enough for Sega to think it would succeed there. And I bought it again. It's not nearly as good as on Dreamcast, but still.
Right. Well, you bring up a point as well that Sega basically once they decided that they were done with the hardware market, they basically decided that they were just going to release software from then on. And so you mentioned the GBA, so they ported stuff to there. But
they've done all right since then. Like at points, they've done well enough to where people thought they were going to get back into the hardware market. I don't foresee that happening anytime soon. I would expect Microsoft to buy Sega before that happened, but
Microsoft needs some help.
But and I mean, Sega's got a hell of a library, but I don't know if they can't buy Activision Blizzard. I don't think they could buy Sega either.
Right. Sega All Stars Racing, fantastic game. That's modern and it's been out for 10 years now, but they've done some good stuff since. But I love the Sega All Star Racing game. That's great.
And I mean, I appreciated that it had some lesser known characters from the Sega IPs. Like it actually had Billy Hatcher, which I think was a Dreamcast game and was really well rated as well. And then it brought Alex Kidd out of the woodwork to be a racer, which was cool. So they really dug deep into their Sonic and Sega All-Stars racing.
Yeah.
And I appreciated that. It was a hell of a lot better than Sonic Riders.
For sure. Awesome. Any other notable items on the Dreamcast?
I did want to mention, so I was curious because I know that the Dreamcast's lifespan was short, right? And of a list of consoles that had the shortest lifespans, it comes in third. And I use the term console loosely because it's really the only one that was a television console proper.
Okay.
The shortest lifespan was the Virtual Boy.
Good.
Understandable.
Good.
Next was the Gizmondo. I have no idea what the hell that is.
Was it released in the US?
It was a little handheld thing. Yeah, I believe so.
Huh.
I think it was sort of it's something kind of like, I think it came out around the same time as like the Engage and the Wonder Swan Pocket or Neo Geo Pocket or whatever, and all those things. So it was like in the midst of all sorts of Gamescom, right? Like all these things that were flash in the pan, nothing. And then after the Dreamcast, so Dreamcast was third. You end up getting stuff like Engage, which I mentioned. I don't know if you remember that, the Nokia.
Yes.
ColecoVision. Okay, I was wrong. There's one full-fledged television console on there, the ColecoVision, which did not have the competition the Dreamcast had.
Right.
And then the PS TV, which based on the name sounds like a television console, but it's just a PS Vita that's digital only. You couldn't put cartridge or the discs into the PS TV. You just could interface with the digital store and download them to the PS TV and play Vita games on your TV.
This sounds like it was too soon for what it was.
Basically, yeah. But it was essentially they were trying to get what they could out of the PS Vita and hoping that people would want to play it on their TV as well. But ditching the physical media, I think is what caused it to flop.
Sure.
It made it cheap, but it didn't make it accessible.
Yeah, every once in a while I toy with the idea of hunting down a Vita just because, I don't know, it was such an entertaining handheld at the time, So, or what was the other one? What was the other handheld that they did?
The PSP?
Yeah, the PSP.
And the digital one, they tried a digital only of that too, the PSP Go. So it didn't have the disc slot anymore. But the games were too big. You couldn't download but like 5 games at a time. Well, I don't know what they were thinking with that.
Isn't that the problem today, though?
I mean, we're getting back to that with 150 gig games. It's a little stupid.
Yeah.
The games are just so inflated and they're like, well, we have all this room for activities, so why compress anything?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I've been playing a lot of, I mentioned last week, I've been playing a lot of Flight Sim, Microsoft Flight Sim, and that's like 170 gigs.
What about Flight Sim 24 that's going to come out soon? Like, that's going to be even bigger, right?
I mean, it's pretty.
It is.
I can basically go most places in the world and it looks like where it is in the world, so it's pretty, But, yeah. Excellent. Yeah.
All right. Well, I think that's pretty much all I've got.
Yeah. A system that shouldn't have died. That's really kind of my take. It's a system that shouldn't have died.
It was a case of all the hallmarks of success were there, except for the history, right? Sega's history was their downfall.
And the DVD market and the piracy. I really think that.
The piracy probably ate into it a lot, honestly. I think there were a lot of Dreamcasts out there and not nearly enough software sales to warrant the amount of hardware out there.
Well, and that really was during the era when hardware manufacturers, the console manufacturers were doing the loss leaders, right? You don't see it so much anymore. Sony isn't really selling their product at a loss anymore, but
I think PS2s were under market, GameCubes were under market. I think the Xbox they were losing like $100 a console.
Yes. Yeah, and I mean
So
they advertised pretty openly that it was like if everybody bought 5 games, we'll come out ahead, right? But um, you know, but yeah, we don't see that anymore, right? But the Dreamcast, I really do feel like was subsidized by expected game sales. So because it was cheap, you mentioned it was cheap.
yeah, it really was. And I mean, it was an awesome console. Like I think some of them even had a little game built into them. The Dreamcast Swirl game was
Mm.
in some of the consoles.
Hmm. I never
But
I never saw that.
if you didn't have it in if you didn't have it in the console, you had it in um the web browser
Mm.
that pretty much came with it anyway, right?
Right. Yeah, yeah, that's true.
It's a stupid little match 3 game, but
Right.
it's something that came with it.
Yeah.
And it's like Sega pushed a lot out for that too, because they even had like Genesis collections on there.
Right.
I have one. It's like 12 in one. And I think I picked it up for $20-$30. So
Nice.
they were not gouging on their software either. It's just
Right.
it's weird. It was a weird time where burning discs was becoming so accessible for most people that it was still worth saving the money to buy the games. I mean,
Right.
even I had a CD. Even I had a disc burner, right? Like I had one of those gigantic ones, is like this big and this thick, and it
Yep.
was a SCSI port, right?
Yeah. Yep. Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's a sad history, but I would suggest to any of our listeners at least try some of the exclusives. In however you can, they're worth your time.
Yeah, there's a lot there's a lot of Dreamcast games out there that you should not bother with. Don't touch Sonic Shuffle. Don't.
Right.
There's a number of them that suck, but that's true for most consoles.
Mm-hmm.
But the gems on this are numerous.
Yeah.
You got Power Stone, you got Dino Crisis, you got the remake of Resident Evil 2.
Mm-hmm.
Not like the current one, but like it was remastered for the Dreamcast, and it was
Right.
so pretty.
Oh yeah.
So like, compared to the PS1 version, oh my goodness. So the Dreamcast was full of gems.
Yeah.
Like it was not a diamond in the rough, it was a diamond in the playpen, right?
Yeah. Yes.
That's how common they were.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, as I said, Rez is worth playing. You mentioned Code Veronica. Yeah. Sonic Adventure is a blast too. It really is. So
Yeah, those are the Sonic Adventure games are kind of hit or miss with people, but I mean honestly, they're good games.
yeah. Yep. Awesome.
So yeah. Anything, look up the Dreamcast, and chances are if you find anything with a good rating and it's a genre you like, you'll enjoy it.
Mm-hmm.
Check them out, please. It's worth your time. The Dreamcast is something too many people missed out on.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Awesome.
All right. You can, I think you can, it's a good time to throw our spiel at the people.
Okay.
You can check out our Discord and tell us if there's anything we forgot, because I'm sure there's tons I forgot, even though I made a ton of notes. Add what your favorite thing is from the Dreamcast. Come to the Discord, talk to us. We like that conversation. I don't think we're super active on other social medias. I think we're kind of there, but with the way social medias are going right now, it's it's a bumpy ride. We're saving our axles here.
Yeah, we're not going to pull a Reddit. Come talk to us on our Discord. We're not going to pull a Reddit.
Yeah, we've got a Reddit, but I don't think we use it much. Even less now. Oof.
Yeah, we do have a little bit of housekeeping. We do have our.
Oh yeah. Do you have a title?
I do. Do you?
Okay, I don't yet. Give me a minute.
Okay, well,
Tell me yours.
I'll give the spiel first. So, we are compiling as a Press B to Cancel host group. We are compiling the Press B to Cancel top 100 retro games. We basically kind of have a end date. Anything before 2005 is fair game. We are also not console exclusive. I've been giving a lot of PC games or even arcade games, but we are compiling our top 100 list. So each episode, the hosts will give a top 100 nominee. Once we have enough nominees, we will go through an internal voting process, and we will shake out our top 100. So while Wulff is looking, I will go ahead and give my top 100. It was one of my top fives. Star Control 2. It was originally a PC game on floppy disk, but thankfully it came to 3DO and they added voiceovers. And then nowadays the creators, Toys for Bob, got the rights to open source it, and you can download it as what's called the Urquan Masters. It's an adventure game, real-time ship-to-ship combat, with a overarching adventure story where you travel the galaxy, or you travel whatever the size of scale is. I think it's probably considered a galaxy, but and you basically interact with a whole bunch of alien races, and it has some of the best humor I think I've seen to date in video games. It has a concept that was very new at the time where as you progress through the game, the timeline would affect what races were available to talk to and what weren't. Some races would wipe the others out if you didn't intervene. And so, but yeah, fantastic adventure game, Star Control 2, or if you want to play it as a modern game, the Urquan Masters, URQUAN.
All righty. Sounds interesting.
Yeah.
I think you mentioned that before, and I was curious to try it out, and I just haven't bothered, sadly.
So before the episode, I pulled it up and I looked it up, and funny enough, in the Wikipedia article, there's actually a section literally called Greatest Games List, which I don't see in a lot of games, and it has appeared on a lot of the Greatest Games lists. So kind of interesting. Yeah.
All right. This one may or may not be contentious, but I think this is a fun one, and it just makes a cutoff.
Okay.
Katamari Damacy.
I'm in.
And well, it's not one of the most cutting edge games ever made, but it's one of the most charming games ever made, and I really feel like it's what kicked off the whole desire for what we now call cozy games, right? And it really was that. It was fun. Even when it was like stressful, it wasn't stressful.
Right.
The music was amazing. The colors were just bright and vivid, and the story was silly and off the wall. And you know, like the king of all cosmos destroyed all the stars in the sky. So of course, as his son, it's your responsibility to fix the problem.
Yep. So
he can't be bothered
by rolling over everything.
Yeah, you're making stars by just rolling everything up that it's in the vicinity and just making as big a ball as you can, right?
Yep.
And boom, that's a star in the sky. You're sucking up like insects and eggs and dominoes and thumbtacks and cars and people and
it becomes more unwieldy as it goes. It's great.
Yeah, like you can make it lopsided to where it's just got one big old pole sticking out of it, and it just you know, and it's so much fun. And by the end of the game, you're just rolling up islands and rainbows and clouds and volcanoes and and kaijus. It's such a fun game, and the soundtrack for that game is still one of my favorite soundtracks ever.
Absolutely.
Even I hum it so often. My kid hums it from time to time, and he's never seen the game in action.
That's awesome.
Just the na 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 tick 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 tick.
Yep, that's awesome. That's awesome. No, I love that game. I haven't played that. Let's see, that's PS2, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It just makes the cutoff in late 2004.
Yeah. Yeah. That was a great game. I support your nominee. So
it's seen a number of sequels, and you know, they're all great. The first one is still probably my favorite, and it's been remastered. It got re-roll, and I think the second one just got re-roll, right? We Heart Katamari. So it's very accessible to find these games. they're not hidden away. Like some of them are, like Beautiful Katamari, I think is only Xbox 360 or something like
Okay.
that. But
Okay.
most of them, and I think one of them was just PSP.
Mm.
But for the most part, you can find them. They're not that
Sure.
hard. And if you can play one, you've basically played them all. They're just slightly different challenges, slightly different stories, but they're still fun. They're
Yeah.
all worth playing.
And as you mentioned, very casual. So yeah, that's awesome. I love that nominee.
All righty. I think that about wraps it up, right?
I think so.
All right. Hey, we're going to lose some crazy money.